Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the services of the Eastside Church of Christ here in Maryville, Tennessee. Our little congregation here has been through a lot in the last couple of weeks. For those that might be listening in that aren't members of our congregation, I need to let you know that we have had 33 positive cases of COVID, most of those just within the past 2 weeks. Currently, 2 of those people are hospitalized, and the other ones are in various stages of either suffering or recovery. And I was looking through our bulletin tonight, and we actually have 80 different people that are listed in the bulletin with either COVID or some other ailment. So our congregation has been through the ringer, and we are now conducting most of our services online, and that's why we are streaming this service tonight. But I do want to welcome you, and tonight we're going to be continuing our series on the parables of Jesus. And the parable that I was assigned is the parable of the mustard seed. This is a parable that is known as a kingdom parable. It's one of the parables that Jesus told to try to get us to understand what the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is like. So if you want to be turning to Matthew chapter 13, we will be getting there in a moment. We spent some time earlier this summer talking about the parables and what they are, so I'm not going to cover that ground again. But I wanted to spend a moment as we begin tonight talking about why parables. Why did Jesus speak in parables? If you look at his 3-year ministry, the first 2 years of that ministry, his preaching was pretty straightforward. And in fact, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's pretty straightforward preaching. He says to love your enemies and to turn the other cheek, and it's very direct messages. It's not until the end of the Sermon on the Mount where we get into some of these stories like the wise and the foolish builders. So he goes from speaking in very straightforward sort of language in his sermons, but then in his last year he shifts almost exclusively to parables. So what changed? Well, I think what changed is he had a confrontation with the Pharisees, and they were upset about him healing on the Sabbath, and he had a confrontation with them. I think he was pretty frustrated with them. And so from that point on, he spoke almost exclusively in his 3rd year of ministry in parables. I think the other purpose in him using parables was it was really a divine judgment on the people that heard them. If I could give an illustration tonight, I want you to imagine that I have a couple of identical puzzles that are extremely difficult. They may be difficult because they have really odd shapes or maybe very unusual colors. But these puzzles, if solved, once solved, reveal a special secret message, the message that could change your life. So I take my audience and I divide the audience into 2 groups. And on the left side, I have a group that is very eager to solve the puzzle. They struggle through it, they work hard, they're very diligent, and they're determined to solve the puzzle and find out what the message is. The group on the right, unfortunately, is very apathetic. Their hearts are hard, they think they know it all. They just sit there, they don't really try. Well, you can imagine with these 2 groups, we're going to get 2 very different outcomes. The group over here on the left is probably going to solve that puzzle. It's going to reveal the message, and really the exercise is going to reveal the hearts of the listeners, who tried, who wanted to get the message, and who didn't. And I think that's what Jesus is doing with his parables. So the parable that I was assigned, you want to advance that, Chris? There we go. The parable that I was assigned was the parable of the mustard seed. And there's 3 accounts of this. The one where we're going to spend most of the time on tonight is in Matthew 13, beginning in verse 31. You can also cross-reference to Mark chapter 4, 30 to 32, and also from Luke 13, 18 to 19. So we have the benefit in this parable of having 3 different accounts that we can look at. The downside is that unlike some of Jesus' other parables, no explanation is given. He kind of leaves it up to us to go through it and sort through it. And so let's look at that first parable there, that first example from Matthew 13. It says, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. So as with the two parables that precede this one, the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds, the man here, we believe, we're talking about Jesus. The field is the world belongs to him, and the mustard seed is the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. The word that I would have you focus in on this account is the word took, T-O-O-K. It implies something that is very intentional. The Greek word there is laban, which means to do something on purpose, to do something with intention, to do something with deliberation. And that something, of course, is the planting of the mustard seed. This planting isn't done by chance. It's not done by coincidence. There's actually a plan in mind. And so God sent the man into the world. He sent Jesus into the world, into the field. And that man has a purpose, an intentional purpose to take the seed and to plant it. So again, the kingdom of heaven that we're going to be talking about tonight in this parable, also known as the kingdom of God, the way I look at it is the spiritual realm where Christ reigns. The inhabitants of this kingdom are Christians or the church. So if you want to be in the kingdom, you got to be added to the church. You have to become a Christian. And God's reign and rule over this spiritual kingdom has both a present-day reality, the church, the body of Christ, and it has a future manifestation. Over in Matthew 25, if we look at verses 31 and 34, it reads, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'" So again, there's a present reality, the church, that we're a part of as Christians, and there's also a future manifestation that happens at the second coming. So before we go any further in this parable, I want to address a couple of common objections that you'll hear when people study this. And the first objection is they say, if we look at these three different accounts, there's differences. In Matthew, it talks about a field. In Mark, it talks about the earth. And in Luke, it talks about a garden. In the Matthew account, the garden plant becomes a tree. In Mark, the garden plant grows into big branches. And in Luke, the seed becomes a tree. So you look at these differences and you say, well, why the discrepancy? What's going on here? Why isn't there consistency? Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Jesus told these parables more than once. He preached and traveled for 3 years, presented many lessons, and as he presented lessons, some of these stories he probably would have told more than once, and as he told them, some of the details would have changed. If you think about if you tell a story or a joke to someone, or if you tell it to different audiences, the details of that story or that joke might change some depending on the context, perhaps the age of the people listening or the setting that you're in. So it's not unusual that he would tell these stories in slightly different ways. More importantly, though, I think, is that the meaning of these accounts is the same. Klein Snodgrass, in his book, Stories with Intent, he puts it this way. He says, "The differences among the accounts are interesting, but they, apart from the possible significance of the tree, do not constitute a difference in meaning. The smallest of the seed is mentioned in Mark and is mentioned in Mark and Matthew and assumed in Luke. Whether it is sown in a field, the earth, or the garden, changes nothing in terms of the parable's intent." And then the second objection that will come up is people will read this parable and they'll say, well, the mustard seed really isn't the smallest of all seeds on the earth. There are other seeds, apparently the orchid seed and the cypress seed, which are actually smaller. So they'll say, was Jesus mistaken here? Well, a couple of thoughts on this objection. First of all, the Greek word there for smallest is microteron. And depending on which definition you use, which translation you use, it can mean smaller, smallest, least of, less, little, or very small. So depending on which definition you use or which translation you use, there really isn't a disconnect in there. He could just be saying it's a really small seed. But I think a better explanation is that Jesus is using here proverbial speech or hyperbolic speech. He's using a well-known cultural reference. Mr. Snodgrass, again, in his book, Stories with Intent, he says, in both the Jewish and Greco-Roman world, mustard seeds were proverbially known for their small size, even though other seeds, such as the orchid and cypress, were known to be smaller. Since we are dealing with a proverbial use, anxiety about issues of accuracy are out of bounds. And then Linsky adds, Jesus is speaking of the seeds that are ordinarily planted in ancient gardens, hence the remark that botanists know about many seeds that are still smaller is pointless. So obviously Jesus knows seeds. He knows what he's talking about here, but he's using this parable and this reference to mustard seed in a proverbial way. In that world, they talked about mustard seeds commonly as being the smallest kind of seed. An example of that I would give to illustrate would be two members of our congregation, Erica and Kevin. They have a business called Island Creek Seasoning. And if you can imagine them putting out a spice that they call the spiciest thing in the world, the spiciest spice in the world. And they pass that around and people buy it and everyone in the congregation knows it as such. It's the spiciest thing in the world. Well, is it really the spiciest in the world? Have we actually gone out and done scientific tests? Have we gathered up all the spices in the world to test them? No, we're using that in a proverbial way. When we say spiciest in the world, we're saying it's really spicy. And when he says it's the smallest of the seeds, he's saying it's really, really small. So what makes the mustard seed so amazing? Why, of all the things that Jesus could use, why did he choose it to use in this parable? The answer is it has a massive capacity for growth. The mustard seed spreads like wildfire. As you can see from this picture here, this is a mustard plant that has grown in Israel and has just kind of taken over a field, all from a seed. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit tonight, do a little bit of show and tell to illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of this parable. I have a picture here of some places that I have been, and I've been a lot of places in my travels. I think I've been to 48 states in about 28 foreign countries. And one of my habits when I travel is I collect mementos, little things to remember the place by. And so when my wife and I went to the Holy Lands, we were at the Temple Mount, and we were on the southern steps, and I picked up a little pebble and took it back with me. We spent some time going to Pompeii, which was buried in ash from the Mount Vesuvius eruption in AD 79, and I picked up a little piece of that ash, and I keep it. When we went over to France, we went on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, which of course is where D-Day occurred, the invasion of Normandy, and I picked up some sand, and I have actually sand from Omaha Beach and Utah Beach in a bottle here. So I like to collect things. My son, I wasn't able to go to the Valley of Elah, but my son, my oldest son, Jason, went there, and he brought me back 5 smooth stones from the Valley of Elah where David and Goliath battled. And then, of course, I went out on Amazon and picked up a slingshot that I can shoot those with if I ever need to. I also have salt from the Dead Sea, where Janet and I floated back in 2013. I have a little rock from Little Round Top in Gettysburg, which was one of the decisive battles of the Civil War. And I also more recently brought back some volcanic rock from Mount Haleakala in Hawaii. So I like to collect things, and I like to keep mementos from those journeys. I remember several years ago I was telling a friend about this habit of mine of collecting things, and he said, I do the same thing when I travel. And the next day he brought in a piece of Anne Frank's wallpaper from her hiding place. So I don't recommend that. Do show some discretion. But the reason I bring all of these mementos up is when I travel and when I'm coming back on an airline, they hand me a customs form. And on that customs form, it asks questions about my travels, where I've been, and what I've been up to. but it also wants to know if I'm bringing anything back into the country. And then when I have to go through customs, a lot of times they'll check your luggage, they'll ask you questions, and so you kind of have to be paying attention to what's going on and how to answer it correctly. But what I have learned is that they generally don't have a problem with rocks or even salt or even beach sand. They're not going to give you much of an issue with that. They're not going to give you a hard time or confiscate that. But you know what gets their attention? You know what will really cause a custom agent's ears to perk up is if you start talking about plants, animals, soils, or seeds. I even read of a missionary who was in the Holy Lands, and he tried to bring back mustard seeds, and he just wanted to do it as a memento. He wasn't going to plant them or anything, and those were actually confiscated at the airport. They didn't want seeds like that brought into the country. So why all the emphasis on seeds? Why would they not give you a hard time about rocks and salt and sand, but they might give you a hard time about seeds? Well, the answer is that tiny seeds have a massive capacity for growth. These little tiny seeds can turn into weeds, and the weeds can take over an entire ecosystem. They can take over an entire field or an entire pond. And so when Jesus talks about the tiny little mustard seed, everybody knew about its massive capacity for growth. When it gets in the soil, it will take off. And I have a picture here of kudzu. For those of you that are in the South, we know what kudzu can do to a field and how fast it can grow and take over things. And so that's kind of the idea here of a tiny little seed that can take over an ecosystem, take over a field. This little seed looks like a tiny little dead piece of organic matter, but locked inside of it is incredible power, incredible potential, an ability to perpetuate itself. In fact, a tiny seed can replicate itself tens of thousands of times just over the course of a single summer. As I was doing research for this lesson, I probably learned more about noxious weeds than I never knew before. But there are actually some counties in the United States that maintain lists of weeds, and they classify noxious weeds as Class A, Class B, or Class C weeds. And one of in Benton, Washington, just as an example, one of their most destructive Class A weeds is the garlic mustard. This tiny little seed, like the one that you see pictured here, can quickly take over an entire property. And that picture there on the bottom right is of a garlic mustard field that has been let kind of turn loose without being controlled, and it has taken over the property. And that, my friends, is the power of this parable. That's why Jesus is using it to compare to the kingdom of heaven. The problem was his followers, the people that were around him, that were looking in on his ministry, what they saw when they looked at it was a ragtag group of followers. And when they saw this ragtag group of followers and they hear him talking about this magnificent kingdom of heaven, I'm sure they were thinking, really? Is this all there is to it? You talk about humble beginnings, and if you think about the whole story of Jesus, there's a lot of humility involved in it. He was a baby who was born in a manger. He grows up as a carpenter. He claims to come from God, and he says and does some extraordinary things. He claims to have a message of hope. And then he enlists 12 pretty ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors. None of them were all that upstanding members of society. And that was his team. He doesn't raise an army. He doesn't seek political office. He doesn't try to overthrow the Romans or anything like that. And so a lot of his followers, they were following him, but a lot of them looked at that, and I think they were kind of disappointed by it. It didn't match their expectation of what they wanted in their king and their Messiah. They wanted a guy to come in, a Messiah to come in with pomp and with circumstance and with power. They wanted a conqueror that was going to help them to take out the Romans. They wanted God to reign and to rule on this earth in a powerful, visible way with strength and power and just overwhelming might. And so when Jesus is traveling around and teaching and preaching, and he's talking and he's announcing that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, they're like, really? This is it? This is the best you've got? So the question that is going on in the background here, the question that is on their minds is God's kingdom really advancing or not? That's what they were worried about. That's what they were wondering about, because this kingdom that they see before their eyes doesn't seem all that impressive, and they're beginning to wonder. So Jesus knows that. He knows their hearts. He knows what they're thinking. And so he tells them this parable of the mustard seed. Excuse me. Earlier this summer, when I was teaching our high school class here and we were studying the parables, I asked the class, I said, if Jesus came back today and he were among us and he was going to teach us and use a new parable, one that had perhaps cultural relevance to us today, and he wanted to describe the kingdom of heaven, what do you think he would use? And not surprisingly, one of the answers that was given was the coronavirus. Here we have a tiny little single virus, invisible to the naked eye, which has spread around the world and has had a huge, devastating impact on the world. 4.3 million deaths worldwide. It's impacted our economy. It's impacted our families. It's impacted our education system. It's impacted really our very way of life. In fact, it's why we are having to stream this service tonight before an empty auditorium. So this is a negative impact with the coronavirus, but it illustrates how something so tiny, a little virus, can grow and have just an incredibly huge impact on everything around it. So that's what Jesus is doing here with a reference, the mustard seed, that would have been very familiar to them. They knew that it was tiny, but that it could grow into something that's grand. And I think in this parable, I think Jesus is telling his audience, you have no idea what God is doing right now, how God is working. You're expecting certain things. You're expecting this Savior to come in and raise an army and defeat the Romans, but that's not what my kingdom's about. And that's why he's using this mustard seed as his reference point. It's small, it's seemingly insignificant, it's just lying there on the ground, this tiny little seed. There's no pomp, there's no circumstance, it's not demonstrating power in the way that you would like to see power demonstrated. But make no mistake, God is working. God's kingdom is present, it is advancing beneath the surface, and at some point, you're going to see what this impact of the kingdom is all about. And so tonight, I would ask the question, as you think about this, the mustard seed, was Jesus right? Was Jesus right about the potential of this tiny little mustard seed? We now have the benefit of 2,000 years have passed. We have been able to see the impact of the cross, the impact of the empty tomb. And on this slide here on the left-hand side, I just have a couple of maps here to illustrate this, but the one on the left-hand side shows the spread of Christianity from 325 to 600 AD. It goes from that tiny little seed, that small ragtag band of followers, and it starts to spread all across the Middle East and into northern Africa and into Europe. From those humble beginnings, it spreads like kudzu, or you might say like a mustard seed plant would spread. And then on the second map there to the right, it shows, it's a more recent map, and it shows the percentage of the world population that at least identifies as being Christian. So I think Jesus was right. I think if you look at the past 2,000 years, the kingdom of heaven, despite very humble beginnings, has been spreading and it has been advancing all around the world. When we want to look just within our own faith group, the Churches of Christ, according to the statistics I looked up, there are 15,000 Churches of Christ worldwide with over 3 million adherents, including 1.3 million people in the United States. We've gone from one preacher, or two if you want to count John the Baptist, to over 7,000 preachers just within the Churches of Christ. And I guess when Ethan Foister finishes preaching school and begins officially preaching full-time, he'll be number 7,001. So in terms of the past 2,000 years, the mustard seed kingdom has exploded with phenomenal growth. And I would say not just growth, but impact. When you think about the impact that Christians have had on the world, there's a lot of our most famous universities around the country who were founded by Christians, or at least based on Christian ideals. Some of them have since moved away from that, but it was Christians who set up a lot of our education system. Same goes for healthcare, same goes for many of our relief organizations founded by Christians. There's over 60 Nobel laureates that at least claim to hold a Christian worldview. So we have just a huge impact that Christians have made since the time of Christ, not just in numbers, not just in growth, but also in impact. And it leads me to wonder, what would the world be like without Jesus? What would the world be like today if there wasn't a church? And it's a pretty scary thing to think about. Well, what about today? Let's back up there. Can you back me up? What about today? I think this parable is especially timely when you think about our world today. If you look at the political landscape today in our world, and I don't care whether you're left, right, or in between politically, but our politics is a mess. The Middle East today is a mess. It's in really bad shape. Afghanistan, it looks like the Taliban is starting to take back over again. I just hate to read about that. In a lot of places, race relations are kind of bad off. We see conflict everywhere in the news. It seems like the world is in a downward moral spiral. COVID is ravaging the world again, and even our own congregation. And so when you look at the world that's out there and you start thinking about this idea of the kingdom and how it's growing and how it's supposed to flourish, there's times when we just go, really, God, is this really what's going on? Your kingdom is present now, and it is advancing here on earth as it is in heaven. And it's very easy to have doubts, and sometimes it's really hard to see that. It seems like, if anything, Christians are sort of losing the battle. In fact, looking at the chart here on this slide, it shows the number of people who identify as Christians, and that number is declining. Excuse me one second. That number is declining. It shows there are 6 regions of the world, and it goes all the way back to 1910, and then it projects forward to 2050. So we're talking about a 140-year period here, but you can see across 3 of those 6 regions, the numbers are declining, and that includes declines in North America and significant declines in Europe. Within the churches of Christ that we're part of, those numbers are also declining. In the United States, the number of baptized believers in churches of Christ have dropped from 1.28 million in 1990 to 1.18 million in 2015. That's a 7.8% decline in 25 years. And that's happening while the U.S. population is growing. So you would expect to actually see growth. Since 2015, churches of Christ are down another 70,251 members, or about 6%. Those are just numbers for our faith group, but if you look across most other faith groups, they're seeing similar declines. And so you look at those numbers and you say, that's discouraging, that's depressing. God, what is going on with the kingdom? We thought this little mustard seed was going to have all this growth, but it seems to have stalled. It seems to have stalled. And the kingdom that we were expecting, the growth that we were expecting and hoping for, is just not happening the way that we had imagined. Well, first century Christians felt the same way. There are moments that they were down and depressed and didn't quite get it, and they felt like nothing was getting accomplished, and they became frustrated and they became discouraged, and that same thing can happen today. And I think the power of this parable is that it is Jesus reminding them back then, and he's reminding us today, that God's kingdom is spreading, that God's will and God's way is advancing here on earth as it is in heaven. But like a mustard seed, we haven't seen it come to its fullness yet. The tree is not done growing. The tree is not yet in view, but the kingdom is moving. The kingdom is spreading. And there's going to be a moment in the future when we're going to see exactly how powerful the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God is in this world. That day is coming. So tonight, I want to remind all of our listeners that are out there, let me remind you of this. You have no idea what God is doing right now. You don't know how he's working, and you don't know where he's working. Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We're not in his league. We can't explain him. We don't know exactly how he is working in the world. We also read in Zechariah 4 verse 10, "Don't despise the day of small things." Don't look down on small things and think that they're somehow not important, that they don't matter. Don't assume that your meager, modest efforts are having meager, modest results. And I would encourage you tonight to avoid what I call I've only language. I've only language. I've only taught one Bible class. I've only impacted one person. I've only filled out one Barnabas card. I've only gone on one mission trip. I've only. Avoid that language. The problem with I've only statements is that they remove God from the equation. You may have only done something small, but God can do something big with it. Also, don't get frustrated thinking nothing is being accomplished. And sometimes preachers have a tendency, preachers and elders and other leaders, they have a tendency to get discouraged that the numbers aren't quite what they should be. The growth isn't quite what it should be. Our numbers aren't growing. Maybe our baptisms aren't growing like we had hoped for. Well, I would just remind you, we're only seeing a glimpse of the kingdom now, but a time will come when we're going to see the fullness of the kingdom. We're going to see the big picture. It's going to be revealed, and it's going to be amazing. Also, don't get discouraged thinking that your work or your role in the kingdom is less than someone else's or less than what it used to be. And my in-laws, Papa Raymond and Shirley, they live with us, and sometimes when I'm talking to them, they'll get frustrated, and I'll hear them say that they're frustrated that they're not able to do what they once did. They're now in their 80s, and they're not able to do the same things they did when they were younger, when they were going on mission trips throughout India, when they were teaching and preaching and doing all of this kind of thing. They're not able to do that, and so it's easy to get discouraged and say, I wish I could do what I once did. And I have to remind them that even though their roles have changed, their impact can still be huge. Their little mustard seed efforts can have a huge impact on people. They can encourage people with phone calls, with cards. My father-in-law is delivering tomatoes all over the neighborhood that he has grown and encouraging people just within our neighborhood, so he can still have a huge impact even though he can't do what he once did. So keep that in mind. Also, don't be dismayed by a seemingly dead-end job or an unappreciative family or what you believe is an insignificant role that you have. Because again, you have no idea how God might be using you in your job or in your family or in your community to advance the kingdom. You may perceive yourself as just a tiny little mustard seed, just doing a tiny little effort, but then God can do something incredible with it. Again, don't assume that because you haven't seen the fullness of the kingdom that it's not advancing, because I'm telling you tonight, it is advancing. Again, you have no idea what God is doing right now and how he is impacting the world through your mustard seed efforts. So let me conclude tonight with just 3 statements, 3 reminders that I hope will be useful to you. First of all, God has called us to do kingdom work. That's what we're here to do. That's our main purpose in this world is to be about the Father's business, to be doing kingdom work. Your efforts may feel small and insignificant at times, but God is doing something huge under the surface. So never forget that. Secondly, your mustard seed efforts may be contributing to that in powerful ways, and you may never know about that this side of heaven. There's things that you're doing, little mustard seed efforts that are going to impact the kingdom long after you're gone, and you're not going to know about it this side of heaven. So don't be discouraged about that. And then finally, we're called to be faithful. We're called to be faithful where we're at in the small things, in the little things, knowing that what we may be doing is planting a mustard seed, and in due time, that tiny seed will become a tree. So that's our message for tonight. Let me close by saying, asking a few questions that you can kind of think about. The first question is, are you in the kingdom? Are you a citizen of the kingdom? Are you a Christian? If so, what is your allegiance to the King? What kind of a citizen are you? Are you at work in the kingdom, doing kingdom work, or are you sitting on the sidelines and not really involved in the kingdom work? You see, these parables that we've been studying this summer are meant to provoke those kinds of questions, to get us thinking. And so tonight, if you're out there listening and you would like to become a Christian, to be added to the kingdom, we can make that happen. We can even make that happen tonight. You can text me at 813-476-2262. I will come and get you. We will bring you to the church building tonight. Chris will help me out. And we're happy to study with you, to teach you and baptize you even tonight. Or if you need prayers, if you're out there and you need prayers, and I can tell you our congregation needs lots of prayers, let us know about those things. Contact the church office, contact me. We'll get you on our prayer list, and I can promise you that a lot of Christians will be praying for you in your situation. We do have a lot of people that are sick in our congregation, but we have plenty of people that are still well, and plenty of people that are willing to help you with whatever you need. If you need groceries picked up, if you need prayers, if you need yard work done, whatever you need, we want to be here to help you, so let us know. I want to thank Chris for being here tonight, running the AV for us, and I want to thank all of you all for tuning in tonight, and I hope that this has been an encouragement to you, and I hope that we will not use I've-only language, but that we'll do the little things in the kingdom so that the kingdom can grow. Thank you.